understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How are you doing there? It is time for the podcast, and it's a rather sad podcast we're bringing you today. Certainly the news is quite sad. John, how are you, mate? You've had a really tough week.
Tough whole week, yeah. My dear mother passed away last week, and funeral was on Good Friday. Half expecting her to see her again on Easter Sunday. She was such a wonderful woman, and it was amazing. There was so many people turned up. It was great. Yeah.
Listeners, I'll just give you a sense of who Carmel Ryan, who was Carmel Ryan before she became Carmel Davis and married John's dad, Aidan. An extraordinary woman, lived across the road from me and us, was like a second mother to me as a kid. And I think vice versa in John's case, coming across to our house, every day. Had not got an easy life because Aidan, John's dad, died when John was 2 years old, leaving Carmel with 1 year. You were one.
Yeah, I was one.
Leaving Carmel with 4 kids under the age of 7. And that in any circumstances is unbelievably difficult. In Ireland of the late 1960s, early 1970s, people with long memories will know it was not a place where getting by day to day was easy. Very interesting story, though, and not one of the reasons John and I are such mates, but it just gives you a sense of how long we've known each other. Carmel then knowing, well, what do I do now? She went back, did a Montessori course and opened a nursery for largely the kids on our road and the roads around us. And that is where John and I rocked up at the age of about 2 or 3, sitting in a sandpit, I think, for most of the day, acting the maggot under Carmel's great tutelage.
The economics, no doubt.
The economics of the sandpits. Carmel looked after us. Then she went back to her original training, which was a nurse in St. Michael's in Dunleary, where she was a nurse for 30-odd years, John, was it? 35-odd years?
Yeah.
But interestingly, and they were really difficult times. And of course, we're kids, so we've no idea how tremendously hard it is just to keep the whole show on the road. Carmel had some very good friends, John's auntie Eileen, who took a great shine to me over the years.
Yeah.
And basically, we're talking about our childhood, John and I's childhood. And his mum then, of course, when she got rid of John, Connor, Shelley and Tony, the other siblings, decided to change her life and become a global traveller. And was particularly fond of the Machu Picchu trail, apparently, John, in Peru.
Yes, that story came out in the eulogy where she was nearly 70 at that stage, and she took off around the world. And I was asking her, so what was the highlight? And she said, I particularly liked South America, and I climbed Machu Picchu. Now, as you know, Mac, I'm kind of into my hiking and stuff, and I was going, that's a hell of a climb. And she goes, it was weird. Like all these young people I was with, they were all getting altitude sickness and headaches and vomiting and stuff. But I was grand. How was that, ma'am? I don't know. I was eating these leaves and drinking this tea, and somebody had offered me some of this white powder and stuff. It was great stuff. Got me up the mountain.
I love it. Carmel doing marching powder as she went up the Machu Picchu.
Yeah.
But anyway, so it's been a difficult week for John and his family. The whole tribe of us who've been mates for donkey's years gathered in St. Patrick's Church in Monkstown, a place that John and I were altar boys together. So it was a very nostalgic trip, and I hope that having all your old mates around, John, helped you a wee bit.
It was great. And Max, she was, as you know, she was incredibly fond of you, but it was a really good send-off. And of late, I'd be chit-chatting and going on drives with her and stuff. And dementia had kind of taken hold, which is a terrible, cruel thing. But she was always saying, so what do you do now? I said, I make podcasts with Macker. Oh, right. And what time are they on at? She couldn't quite get her head around it.
That's brilliant. It's brilliant. Well, listen, anyway, Carmel Davis, R.I.P., a great life, a great mother. a great neighbor, and somebody who will be remembered by all of us. And I know John's extended family, but all of us who grew up together. She was one of the ever present, ever dependable. We spoke about it at the funeral, stoic, but with a funny sense of humor beneath the
Yeah.
stoicism all the time. So that's John's mother, ladies and
Thanks,
gentlemen.
Mac. Thank
Not
you
at
for
all,
that.
John, not at all. And we will carry on with the podcast. And the podcast today, John, I want to talk about is the Great Game. So the Great Game was, this came to me, I'm up in Belfast as looking after Shan's mother. I suppose that's really what happens to us, isn't it?
Yeah. We've hit that
you know,
age, haven't we?
yeah, exactly. And what I'm always intrigued about Belfast up here in general is the way that they love a memorial, right? They love a war memorial. Okay, they really do. And it's
Yeah.
struck me that over the years, going to Church of Ireland churches around the south, what always struck me is when you go to Church of Ireland churches, in particularly the rural ones, the really rural, isolated ones, and I've been in loads of them, there has always been a difference. And one of the main differences between the Catholic Church and the Church of Ireland Church are the plaques on the wall. So Catholic churches tend typically to have the Stations of the Cross and the confessionals, and that's it. But Protestant churches, being Protestants, they use all the space very sparingly, and the space they use is usually for the interned bodies or plaques to remember some of the local, usually military members of the community who died in bizarre places all over the world.
Yeah.
So, you're down at somewhere like Mount Rath in the middle of County Laois, and I remember being at a very, very old Church of Ireland church there. And the plaques on the walls of these exotic places, like fellows who died in Darfur and Kabul and Johannesburg and, parts of the Hindu Kush and all these things. And it always struck me as, what were these young fellas dying in these places for? And a place that comes up time and time again, it's in the news right now, is Crimea. So you see this idea of plaques to young fellas who died in the Crimean War. The Crimean War is a war between Russia and the UK, or Russia and the Kingdom of Great Britain, I presume as it was known at the time, or Great Britain.
That was the charge of the Light Brigade, wasn't it?
Exactly. And you think, what were the Brits doing fighting the Russians in Crimea? And this is part of the thing called the Great Game. And the reason we're talking about the Great Game is we now have a new Great Game between China and America. But the old Great Game gives us a framework. And the old Great Game was between Russia and the United Kingdom. And the reason was the following, was called the overland passage to India. So it was the Hindu Kush, which is, is this big mountain range, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, all those parts of the world. And the Russians were trying to protect what they regarded as their southern flank from the British. And the British were trying to protect what they regarded as the safe overland passage to India, which was the jewel of the crown. And therefore, the Great Game was when those two big powers rubbed up against each other. And as we always say, when big powers rub up against each other, little powers suffer.
Yeah.
And the world tilts on its axis. And then the people who suffered, bizarrely in, again, this thing we talk about all the time, John, the law of unintended consequences, were young Church of Ireland fellas from Portlaoise and from Kilkenny, from Cork and Tipperary, Cavan, all those ending up dying in Crimea. Now, the interesting thing is we know, of course, in Ireland that an equal number of Catholics signed up with the British Army.
Yeah.
And in fact, some of my own family being part of that, but they were largely forgotten about after the 1916 Rising, which, as you noted before we came on, the anniversary is on Thursday, John. We might even do
it is.
a 1916 piece. But so we sort of, I think in Ireland, it's fair to say, we rewrote our history simply because we had to, because our history was written by somebody else prior to that. And a lot of those guys, the Catholic members of the British Army, the British Forces, British Navy, were kind of airbrushed out of history, whereas for the Protestant community, they were remembered. Now, what interests me, though, John, is not the historical treatment of young men who fought. That's for a different podcast. But it's this idea of the Great Game. So what was very important to see, I think, in the last couple of weeks in the chaos of Trump was, is there a strategy? Is there something?
That has been the big question always about Trump. Does he have any idea what he's doing? Or maybe he does. So
I think the laziest thing and the easiest thing to do is say he's mad, right?
Yeah.
And that won't get us anywhere.
He is.
He is, but that won't get us anywhere. What I think
Yeah.
it's more interesting to look at is, are we looking now at the evidence suggesting that the United States really wants a war exclusively with China, a trade war exclusively with China? And is it trying to use the rest of the world as hostages, in a sense, in its great game? So just take this image in your head, and particularly if you're European. And remember, I was telling you last week I was in France, and a lot of things became clearer to me in France than they did in Ireland, simply because a language difference, cultural difference, French long-term antipathy towards the United States. But to get back to the point, the idea is that Trump, in a kind of a mafiosi way, sees the world as a hostage taker. So the hostage is European prosperity,
Mm.
European alliances, etc. Trump is saying, look, you've got to be on our side. You are the hostage. If you want to be released from tariffs, you have to side with us against China. And the ransom is you signing against China with us. If you do that, we will leave you alone, and American and European trade can continue as is.
Yeah.
The Europeans, therefore, have to make a choice. Are we, and I say that in the broadest sense, are we happy to be a hostage to the United States, or do we have alternatives? Does the hostage have alternatives? I.e., can the hostage say, well, you know what? We could equally be hostage to China, and we will actually play the game. Now, what interests me about the great game is how at pivotal moments in history, John, alliances do crumble and they change. And so the question in this podcast is, will the Europeans react to American bullying, not by bending the knee, kissing the ring, and saying, yes, America, we will do what you say, but by saying, you know what? It might be time for us to have an alliance with China. And is America in danger of pushing Europe into the arms of China, as opposed to cleaving Europe away from China?
Yeah.
And my sense is that there is a real danger for the United States and for the European alliance, that what is happening now pushes the European Union closer to China. Why? Because the European Union, and France in particular, is a very significant debtor. So the French government is a serious debtor. And a debtor always needs a creditor.
Yeah.
The creditor for a long time were ourselves, Europeans, the Americans, etc. Maybe France just says, you know what? Let's do a deal with China. Let China become our creditor.
I suppose also it depends on if the EU can remain unified.
Yeah.
And some of the Europeans may suffer from Stockholm complex or whatever it's called.
Stockholm syndrome, where they fall in love with the hostage taker.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, well, first I want to talk to you about what I think is going to happen in the next 2 or 3 months in financial markets, because financial markets have always been very important, but we now know they're even more important because it's the one, as I said, I think last week, the official opposition to the Republican Party in the United States is not the Democratic Party, it is the bond market. I think, first of all, let's start in China. So last week, news came out of China, last week alone,
Yeah.
that up to 20 million jobs will be shed in China in the coming months in Chinese manufacturing. As Chinese manufacturing,
20
20
million.
million, as Chinese manufacturing begins the process of cutting back ahead of the US tariffs, right?
Wow.
The Washington consensus in Washington, which is the Republican Party are using, is that they believe that over the course of the next 5 years, if tariffs squeeze the Chinese, and if the 75 US adjacent countries, that's including the EU, come along with the Americans and get on side with the Americans in this hostage taking situation, that China could lose up to 150 million manufacturing jobs.
Wow.
One of the closest guarded
Wow.
secrets in the Chinese, well, this is what the Republicans in America are hoping for. They're hoping
Yeah.
to bring China to their knees. One of the closest guarded secrets in China is the official youth unemployment rate, which could be as high as 30% if, for example, these tariffs begin to bite. And of course, that is the one thing that the People's Republic of China does not want, which is lots and lots of fellas kicking their heels with nothing to do, fermenting revolution and counter-revolution.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what the American ploy is to bring the Chinese to their knees via trade, destroying their manufacturing base, reducing it dramatically. Now, what do the Chinese do in that situation? Obviously, the first thing you do in a situation where your demand is being profoundly constrained by tariffs is you drop your exchange rate, and you drop your exchange rate dramatically. And that, I think, is something we've got to factor in. Number one. Number two is they redivert their trade to Europe, or try to redivert their trade to Europe. And this is where the Europeans have leverage over both the Americans and the Chinese, ironically, because if the Europeans don't join the American trade blockage of China will not work. This is the
Yeah.
very simple thing. And if they do join the Americans, then China will forever regard the Europeans as an unstable enemy, which I'm not sure that many Europeans want to be that character. So America needs to offer Europe something enormous over and above rescinding tariffs, I think,
Yeah.
to get the Europeans on side. So that's the first thing. Second thing is to look at the internal dynamics of what's happening in the United States now in the financial markets, right? So in the first week of May, the FOMC, which is the Federal Open Market Committee, stupid term, but these are the fellas who sit around, the sage technocrats who sit around at the top of the Fed and decide are they going to cut rates or not.
Right.
Now, the futures market is only pricing in a 20% possibility of a rate cut in May, despite the fact, John, that $12 trillion of wealth has evaporated in the first 3 months of the first 100 days of Trump. 12
Yes.
trillion, okay? Despite the fact that the dollar is down 10%, significantly indicating that people expect the Americans to go into recession, and despite the fact that the American bond market is all over the shop. That is a technical term, John, for the bond market zapping up and down, right? All
These are
that
the bond market vigilantes.
Exactly. But the
Yeah.
problem now is, and this is an interesting, let's get into the weeds of financial markets. So in 2008, when all the banks failed, the problem for bad debts arose within the banking system. Today, the problem for highly leveraged outfits aren't the banks per se, but they are all the hedge funds, which I call the bank adjacent funds, right? They are in meltdown. I would be surprised if many of these hedge funds don't go bust overnight, or don't go bust over the course of the next couple of months.
Really?
Because they're the
Okay.
ones that have taken these big leverage positions on US equities. They're the ones that are now being forced to come up with margins for margin call investments. They're the ones that need liquidity. There is no liquidity. In effect, the central bank should be giving a large overdraft to the system, which is basically
Yeah.
how it works. You go to the bank and say, we've run out of money. And the bank says, well, is it a liquidity problem or an insolvency problem? The Federal Reserve says, okay, if it's a liquidity problem, we'll just give you money and we'll tide you over, which is what a bank would do normally. Let's say
Yeah,
a company loses a few customers, but is a good fundamental business.
But are we seeing a lot of the hedge funds disappearing already, or?
They're highly secretive because they are, the difference between hedge funds and banks is because the banks had a share price and they were owned by shareholders. As people got nervous about the banks, they sold the shares of the banks, which in 2008 was the canary in the coal mine, which is basically gave people a signal there's something going on here.
Yeah.
Hedge funds are not owned by shareholders. There are no share prices. They're very, very secretive. They are very, very greedy places. They are full of people who believe, basically, they're what they're called millionaire makers. So you join a hedge fund and you become a millionaire. And it's all very secretive, and it's kind of bragging as well. I mean, I've met loads of them. There is no lower form of humanity than a bragging hedge fund manager.
Yeah, that's the
in New
impression
York.
I've always got about
They're
hedge
awful
funds.
creatures.
Yeah.
Awful
Yeah,
creatures.
yeah.
Yeah. So there will be no great gnashing of teeth if those hedge funds go to the wall, right? But they do play a role in financial markets. So expect more and more hassle, right? And background
Well,
noise and news.
so
and all that.
them going to the wall will create even more volatility in the market.
Yeah, so I think this is what we're looking at in the next couple of months. And then you think, okay, well, what happens if the Federal Reserve doesn't cut interest rates? Now, why would it not cut interest rates in this situation? Because it's very worried about inflation. Now, it's not that inflation now is a problem. Inflation now isn't that far above 2%, which is their target. But the problem is down the line, the impact of tariffs on American inflation. I'll give you another statistic, right? 70% of the inventory of Amazon.com comes from China,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
30% of the
Wow.
inventory of Walmart comes from China.
Yeah.
You stop those Chinese goods getting into America, or you tariff them, and you've got an automatic inflation problem. So that means that the Fed will not cut interest rates because it's worried about inflation. So what happens then, and we saw the first glimmer of it last week, Donny, the corporate Don, mafiosi
Yeah.
Don, decides to get rid of Jay Powell.
Yeah. Never
Or-
liked him.
Never liked him. He's been, I think he said last week, his demise couldn't come early enough for me, or something like that, right?
Right.
And Jay Powell responded and said, it is illegal. You cannot legally fire me. And we know that Trump doesn't really care that much about legal issues.
Yeah.
You know?
Take a hit out on him.
Take a hit. Anyway, the point is, can you imagine that?
He's going to whack him.
Imagine a situation where the Fed sits on its hands. It doesn't raise interest rates because it's worried about the long-term juggernaut that is inflation coming down the track. All the news is about the pain in China, and China's going to blink, and China's going to buckle, and Europe's going to buckle. But the Europeans say, well, maybe, we're not really involved in your war. Then what happens is Trump installs a patsy at the top of the Fed and says to that patsy at the top of the Fed, you've got to reduce interest rates. Now, why is he saying you've got to reduce interest rates? Because all the while, if American interest rates stay very, very high, mortgage rates stay very high. They're about 7 or 8% in America. If the suggestion is they're going to go any higher, the housing market tanks.
Yeah.
Let's say the housing market lose 20% in America. That's a big, big hole in the MAGA movement, because the MAGA movement are homeowners.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So Trump, in order to avoid that, gets a patsy and puts that patsy into the...
Who's that likely to be? Or are there any names in the frame?
There's a guy called Kevin Warsh, who he was, I think, quite partial to, who was in the previous FOMC. I'm not sure, John. And, given the MAGA movement plucks people out of nowhere,
Yeah.
I think it would be a fool's game to actually say, well, here's the pool of candidates, because, nobody saw the Howard Lutnicks come in, or the Stephen Millers come in, or all those guys, right?
Yeah.
So, but what I say is, paint this picture. This is a picture of the next couple of months, couple of quarters, right? They get a patsy in the Fed. That guy does what Donny says. He cuts US short-term interest rates to 1%. And the reason this is important, John, is the Fed can't control long-term interest rates indefinitely, because the long-term interest rate, John, is the short-term interest rate plus a risk premium, right?
Yes.
So the risk premium is going to go through the roof in the United States. That means the yield curve. So this is for real bond aficionados, right? The difference between short-term and long-term interest rates, the yield curve becomes massively upward sloping. And what that means, that short-term interest rates could be at 1%, but long-term interest rates could be at 6 or 7%.
Right.
And it's that 6 or 7% that controls the bond market, John.
Right.
And the bond market controls the price at which the United States pays back its debts.
But that becomes more attractive, though, for people to buy US bonds because they get a bigger interest rate.
They get a bigger interest rate, but the reason they're getting a bigger interest rate is because the risk of holding American assets is higher.
Yeah.
Okay. So you've got to weigh that up. So what I'm saying is, John, this gives us, I think, a reasonably plausible central case as to what is likely to happen in the world, the financial world, over the next 12 months. And it is against that background that Europe has to make a decision. Are we with the Americans against the Chinese? Are we with the Chinese against the Americans? Or do we, to use Donny's expression, hold all the cards?
Right. Okay, Mike. So let's come back to this one. This is fascinating stuff. After a bit of this. Okay, Mike, we're talking about this great game between America, Europe, and China. But actually, just before we continue on that, there was, I don't know if you saw that interview with J.D. Vance, where he called the Chinese peasants, those peasants making on just extraordinarily rude and disrespectful. Like, he's a horrible guy. But I loved the reaction to that because the Chinese government allowed that video to go viral, which of course got all the Chinese up in arms. But there's some brilliant responses, brilliant memes. So one of them was, Chinese guy came back and says, "Have you even said thank you for all the money we've lent you, JD Vance?" It's just brilliant.
Well, actually, the funny thing is that's where we're going to focus the second part of the podcast, is capital flows around the world
Yeah.
and where the money goes. So what we just said at the top, right? Little reminder that we are now in a great game between America and China. After the last 6 weeks of chaos, a pattern is beginning to emerge, which is that America, or the Trump administration's real enemy, is China. And what it's trying to do is it's trying to conscript Europe into its battle with China.
Mm.
It seems to believe that Europe has no choice, i.e., they have all the cards, to use their expression. But that's not the case, number one. And number two, the European reaction against the Americans, or at least the reaction against which they're going to make this choice, will be framed by what's going on in financial markets and trade flows, what's going on in the real world at this time. And what I've just done before the break, John, is painted a picture of what is likely to be happening in financial markets in the United States, in exchange rates and bond rates,
Yeah.
in the
Yeah.
institutional fragility or strength of the United States, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, given all the competing power plays that are going on within the United States. It's also likely to lead to a big devaluation of the Chinese currency and a flood of cheap Chinese goods into Europe. Now, the Europeans might take the view, well, hold on a second, are we getting even better Chinese goods, even cheaper? Isn't that
Yes.
not a good deal for
Yeah,
European
yeah,
consumers?
yeah.
Because to quote Dave Chappelle, the American comedian, Europeans want to wear Nikes, they don't want to make them, right?
Yes.
You know,
Yeah, yeah,
like,
yeah, yeah.
you know, Europeans want to actually use cheap iPhones made in China. We don't want to make them.
Yeah.
But the fascinating situation now is whether Europe needs to be the hostage. And if Europe doesn't want to be the hostage, is there a different worldview whereby the Europeans can actually change allegiances, right?
Yeah.
Because again, the American tariff policy, which is aimed to strangle China, aims to reduce massively Chinese employment in manufacturing. And that's where they think the Chinese Communist Party will react, because the Chinese Communist Party is most worried about idle young men and women under 30s in unemployment, right? So that's the sort
Yeah.
of framework. So the Europeans are being co-opted into this American worldview. But maybe the Europeans say no. And again, it comes back to when I was in France, right? Now, France is both, like always, it's a mercurial player. It is both a strength because they have grand designs, but it's also a weakness in the sense that France is fundamentally not a particularly robust economy. It is the fifth largest economy in the world, but it's highly, highly indebted. I'll just give you a few statistics, John, right? The public and private debt together, French total debt is 319% of GDP. That's the second highest in the developed world after Japan.
Wow.
It's very, very high now. But again, they have
That must
huge
make them
assets.
very vulnerable.
They are very vulnerable because they need to keep financing this. Now, that's not to say that they don't have huge assets on the other side of the balance sheet. But be that as it may, there is a significant vulnerability in France, which is on the debt side of their balance sheet. Also, government spending as a percentage of GDP is 58%. That is the highest in the developed world. So that means that every single year, government spending in French GDP constitutes close to 60%. So €6 in every 10 that are spent in France every year are spent via the government. So that means the state is enormous in France.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
the downside is it looks bad in a balance sheet. The upside is it has very, very good public services, all those things we know about living in France. But debt servicing now, both households and business, uses up about 20% of their after-tax income. So that is a very, very high percentage. And the gross debt of France is about 248% of GDP, or about 7.7 trillion. Now, why is that? Because the French have sold their debts in huge quantities to fellow European citizens. So
Yeah.
Irish pension funds own them, German pension funds, etc., own French debt. But it means that France is heavily reliant on foreign capital. Now, much of
Yeah.
it's held within the EU, within the Eurozone, but still in all, it is foreign capital. What happens if there is a crisis in France? And by that, I mean, France is a great country, it's kind of ungovernable.
Yeah.
Macron lost his parliamentary majority there in June. They've had two governments since June. The first one couldn't keep the whole show on the road. They now have sidelined Marine Le Pen. But of course, it means
Yeah.
that the right-wing parties and the extreme left-wing parties are still very, very popular in France. It's coming into an election cycle. Who knows? The French could have a sixth republic before the end of the decade.
And
Okay?
that Marine Le Pen appeal against her exclusion is coming up in the summer, and that could kick off a summer of discontent and riots and all
All
sorts.
sorts of stuff. All sorts of
Yeah.
stuff. You're absolutely right. So now France is both a strength and a weakness, right? The strength is the pretensions of grand designs and the French leadership and all that sort of stuff, which Europe needs. But the weakness is that fundamentally its balance sheet is fragile. But not only is it fragile, it's dependent heavily on foreign financing. Now, who is the world's biggest creditor? It is China.
Yes.
Who's got the world's largest reserves? It is China. Who has got the world's largest exposure to American debt? It's China. So let's just say this thing plays out. The Chinese realize that the trade war with America is irreversible. It's non-negotiable because the Americans don't want to negotiate. So they say to the Americans, well, hold on a second, we're going to pull our assets out of your country because you know what? If we believe what McWilliams has just portrayed as the 1 or 2 year option for the American bond market, we don't want to be holding these assets anyway.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
even on a commercially sound basis, we don't want to own you. And frankly, the only reason we owned American assets and lent you money, back to your meme friend, is the only reason we lent you money is we knew that by lending you money, you'd buy our shit because you don't produce anything.
Yes.
Now, if you're saying to us, lend us money and you're not going to buy our shit, we're going to say to them, do you know what? We're not going to lend.
Yeah.
Now, what that means is China needs to look for somewhere else to put the money because it doesn't have the capacity of its own economy to absorb all its own income, right?
Yeah.
Because it's a massive exporter. And it goes knocking on the door of France and says, listen, guys, would you guys like some of our money? And the French say, yeah, cool. We'll have
Yes,
some of
but
that
after
money."
lunch.
After lunch, yeah. We have a bit of foie gras. We have still a bit of foie gras to eat, and we've a confit de canard. And after that, the Spaniards could say the same thing. The Italians could say the same thing. Europe is an old continent. It's an old continent that wants to maintain its standard of living. It needs a stable creditor on international markets. A stable creditor, not
Yeah.
an unstable creditor. It needs to be able to say, look, if we do business with you, you're going to be around in 10 years' time. You're going to be around in 20 years' time.
Yeah.
And you know what? You're producing all these cheap consumer goods for us that, frankly, we will never produce again because we've gone up the so-called value chain. We've become a service economy. France exports Hermes bags and really swanky tours around the Eiffel Tower to Chinese people. It's a high-end service economy.
Yeah.
So there is a very real possibility that the Europeans in general say to the Americans, look, I'm not sure that we need you. And that will be a complete and utter shock in the United States.
Mm.
And some members of the MAGA movement will like that because there is this, remember we talked this hyper isolationist strain in the MAGA movement who
Yeah.
really don't want any part and parcel or any involvement with the world.
Mm.
They'll be happy with that. But there's also this huge part of the American military, industrial, political complex that sees America as the policeman of the world, sees America as an empire,
Yeah.
an empire that has
But then-
alliances all over the world.
Does America use that extra strong arm factor of Russia and emboldens Russia to add more pressure on the Eastern Front, as it were, the threat of invasion, and also, as we were talking about the signal chat that was leaked, they were bombing Yemen to protect the Suez Canal, where the Chinese goods come into Europe.
Well, the Americans can do quite a lot, but on the issue of Ukraine, it's more interesting. Russia cannot do anything without China. China keeps Russia going. Russia sells its oil, its gas to China. In return, the Chinese give them consumer goods. China is Russia's major ally. The Europeans could say to the Chinese, look, guys, we could do a deal with you, but you've got to rein in the bear.
Your man, yeah.
You've got to rein in the bear. We don't want him knocking on our door. We'll do a deal with you. We'll encircle the United States. We will break the ties that bind with the United States because the United States has broken the ties with us originally. We are quite happy to play both off each other. There's 410 million of us in the EU. There's only 360 million Americans. So we're even a bigger population. And in that case, MAGA is completely outsmarted, outfoxed. And what looked like a royal flush turns out to be a pair of sevens. That's all they have. Right? Do you know what I mean?
You're always a card shark.
I tell you, late night, smoky rooms. But that's, I think, where the world is going. And the French, together with Italians and Spaniards, etc., have got, and of course the Germans, because they're the ones who feel most betrayed by the Americans and most left out, have got a reason to do a deal with China, to ask China to rein in Russia, because they know America can't rein in Russia because America doesn't have the firepower or the influence, can keep our market open to the Chinese, can ask the Chinese to buy our bonds, and go back to the table in the card game and say to Mr. Trump, you don't have a royal flush. You got a pair of sevens, and we've seen your bluff.
But we need a good card player in Europe.
Well, as they always say in the game of cards, John, you've got 5 minutes to understand who the gobshite is at the table. And if you haven't understood who the gobshite at the table is after 5 minutes, it's you. And we'll talk to you Thursday, John. Now, before we go, Johnny boy, Dalkey Book Festival tickets out this Friday. You and I are kicking off with a podcast on Thursday, the 12th of June. The following day, John, I'm talking to the brilliant psychiatrist, linguistic psychiatrist, Steven Pinker, probably one of the premier brains in the world.
Yeah.
And we're doing a gig on the psychology of money because he is fascinated by what money does to us. What we're going to do is, if you are following us on Patreon, you will get first dibs on these tickets. Those tickets go on sale to Patreons. That's patreon.com/Dave McWilliams at 9 o'clock on Wednesday morning, and on general release, 9 o'clock on Friday morning. So if you want to get your hands on tickets, and you know these tickets go very, very quickly at Dalkey, we have over 80 events, over 4 days, over 100 speakers in 7 venues in one little small town. Love to see you there. DalkeyBookFestival.org, or if you want first dibs, follow us on Patreon, patreon.com/Dave McWilliams. And we'll talk to you Thursday, John.